Yeah, of course. Me too. Be giving an in-service. Started it. Perfect. Record to this computer, record to this cloud. Which one is it? Okay.
You think it's right?
Yeah.
Are you impersonating IT officer?
All right. Am I doing anything with it? Okay. All right, I'll say good morning. Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Melon, Karen, Ram, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in honor of the entire Kihila and the entire Chabura. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Justin and Rebecca Meirowitz, in honor of Justin's birthday. Incredible. Mazel tov, Justin. Mazel tov, mazel tov. A great way to start off his birthday with the Daf. Beautiful. Incredible. It should be a beautiful day, a beautiful year, and should lead into incredible years of Mazel Bracha, Simcha, Hatzlacha, Ameh Ve'esrim Shanim Tovos. And we'll see with that, let us begin. So we are picking up, today's Daf is Chav Hey. We have some really great Gemara ahead of us today. Let's just pick up again on Chav Daled Amud Beis with Amar Rava, which I will say, again, is pretty much the middle of 24b, right? We actually left off a few lines below that, but let's just pick up there again. Amar Rava, Yisar Shechalku va'avar echad mehem, v'hefrish achar tachtov. So again, remember, we're dealing with the cases of the pieces of mincha that are separate and ultimately, again, put in the kli, but not touching. In this case over here, so remember again, a mincha is made up of one isaron. In this case, the isronos, the two pieces are split, or the piece of the isaron is split into two. You went ahead and one of them was subsequently lost. After that, you went ahead and you separated a replacement. V'hefresh achar tachtov, v'nimtza harishon. Then afterwards, you found the first one, and you ended up putting it in the kli. And all three are now sitting in the kli together. So interestingly enough, obviously that's more flour, right? That's more isronos than you need for the minchas, 1.5 isronos, but they're all sitting in the kli. So we'll say, now what's the halacha? Now obviously, same kind of case, they're not touching. Nitma avod. So again, what is the halacha? So remember, based on yesterday's daf, we saw the concept that kli mitzaref. A kli ultimately combines things together, making them into one entity. So the question is, in this case over here, nitma avod. If the piece that was lost and subsequently found, if it becomes tamei, avod verishon mitztarfin, the first, right, the lost one and the first one, which essentially are the two components of the original mincha, they combine. When it says they combine, is that if one of them becomes tamei, the other one becomes tamei. Mufrash in mitzdarif. However, again, the one that was mufrash literally means designated. That means the replacement one is not tamei, because halacha l'maisa, that's not really part of the core mincha. Nitma mufrash verishon mitzdarfin avod ein mitzdarif. However, again, if the designated one became tamei, then ultimately, again, the designated one combines with the first one, because remember, again, they're really the replacement one. The replacement one and the first one combine, meaning they both become tamei. Avod ein mitzdarif. The lost one does not become tamei. Nitma rishon. If the first piece became tamei, then shnehem mitzdarfin. Then the two other pieces become tamei as well. So essentially, the rule that the Gemara seems to be espousing, that Rav is espousing, is same idea as we saw in yesterday's daf, which is that a kli is able to unite disparate parts, even if they're not touching. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, when one part becomes tamei, the other parts become tamei as well. That is the halacha. That is the halacha. What the Gemara is introducing, what Rav is introducing over here is essentially only the pieces that are really necessary for the mincha together are the ones that become tamei. So essentially, when one of them becomes tamei, only its sister parts, the necessary other part to complete the mincha, will become tamei. The only exception to this is if, quote unquote, the first piece becomes tamei. The first piece is a piece of the original mincha that was not lost. That piece is connected by definition to the two other pieces, and therefore, if it becomes tamei, everything becomes tamei. All right, Abaye says, no, not necessarily. Afilu nitma echa mehem, na mishnei mitzdarfin. Abaye says it's not true. whenever one piece becomes tamei, the other two automatically combine. My timer, what's the reason? Kulu b'nei biksa dahadadininu. Literally, again, they all live in one house. So Abaye's opinion is the kli, by definition, unites everything. So anything that is in the kli, and when one item becomes tamei, everything becomes tamei. The Gemara says, "B'chein le'inyan kamitza." This same halacha, the same concept that the Gemara just brought down by Tuma will also apply by Kamitza. For example, Kamatz mina avod shiyarav berishon ne'achal. So this is the same case where you have a mincha, you split it into two pieces, you put it in the same kli. One of the pieces was lost. You went ahead and you designated a replacement piece, and then you find the lost piece, and put it back in as well. So now all three pieces are in the kli. Kamatz mina avod, if you did kamitza from the piece that was lost and subsequently found, shiyarav verishon ne'achalin, then the shiraim of that piece, as well as the first piece, can be consumed because they're the mincha unit. Mufrash eno nechal, but the replacement piece, ultimately again cannot be consumed. Kamatz mina mufrash, if you ended up doing kamitza from the replacement piece, then shiyarav verishon ne'achalin, then the shiraim of that piece, as well as the first piece, can be consumed. Avud eno nechal, but the lost piece that was subsequently found cannot be consumed. Kamatz mina rishon, if you did kamitza ultimately again from the first piece, then shnehem eno ne'achalin, then neither of them, in other words, neither piece can be consumed. Again, that's because they're both saying, because obviously that's too much mincha, right? In other words, that halacha l'maisa, the first piece is connected to both pieces, but if you do kamitza from the first piece, then that drags in the other two, and then you have too much. In other words, you're overflowered for the mincha. Abaye says, afilu kamatz me'acha me'ha ne'achalin. Abaye says, I'm sorry, afilu kamatz me'acha me'hem shnein ein ne'achalin. Sorry, Abaye says, no. Whatever you do kamitza from, you can't eat anything else, because Abaye says they're all connected. Again, Rabosai, remember, when they're all connected, the problem is I have 1.5 esronos now for a karba mincha, which invalidates a mincha. That's too much flour. So Abaye says they're all connected. Therefore, whatever one you do kamitza from, the mincha is going to be invalid. My time. What's the reason for this? Kulhu nami b'nei biksa dahadadininu. All of these ultimately again live in one house together. Okay, so Rabbi says, so same machlokes by Tuma, same machlokes by Kamitza. So the Gemara says as follows. Maskef Rapapa. Rapapa says, 1 second. V'shirayim didei miha ne'achalin. Now, again, according to what Rava said before, there are cases in which the shiraim of the item itself that you took kamitza from could be consumed. But how could that be? Ha'ika danka de kometz de lo karev. Because you have a combination, danka literally means 1/6. But as Rashi points out over here, 1/6 doesn't have to mean 1/6. By definition, in all of these cases, don't you have alien material mixed in? To which the Gemara says, Maskif la, in other words, there's a piece of the kometz that somehow is embedded in the other pieces as well, that will not be offered up. How can you offer up the kometz itself? The Gemara says, ha'ika tlasa chulin. Literally, again, there's 1/3 of it that's chulin, which again is another way of saying that the kamitza is representative of all the pieces in there. In which case, halacha l'maisa, again, you have in that kamitza represented extra flour that's not part of this mincha. To which the Gemara says, Rav Ashi Amar, kometz bedaited the kohen talia milsa. It's very interesting. When the kohen takes the kometz is fundamentally dependent on the das of the kohen, on the intent of the kohen. The kohen ki kometz, aisarn ka kometz. And when the kohen goes ahead and takes the kamitza, he only has in mind that kamitza should devolve, or that kamitza should represent 1 isaron of flour. So essentially, by definition, he excludes from his kamitza any additional amounts of flour that do not belong to that mincha. Incredible. So I just want to point out there are a couple of significant halachic takeaways from this sugya, which is number one, the concept, we mentioned it many times, kli mitzarif, that the kli brings everything together. So therefore, again, at least for tumah purposes, we know that this concept is going to be true. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if you have multiple pieces of the same item, but the pieces are not touching, and they're in the same kli, when one of those pieces becomes tamei, all of the pieces become tamei. Now, the one interesting case that we did not resolve in yesterday's daf was, what about this case of a mincha? So again, with tumah, I understand how it works. What about the case of the mincha, where I take the isaros, split it in half, and now I have 2 esronos? So what if I do kamitza from one of those, does that work? Does that work for the Karban Mincha? So the Rambam Paskins halacha l'maisa, it's a safek. He says it's a safek, and therefore he says don't do it. And he says if you did do it, you can't offer up that kamisa. It's just interesting. Halacha l'maisa, although it's clear according to everyone that it works by tuma, it's not clear according to everyone that it'll work by kamitza. Okay, very interesting. So we'll say Mishnah Chav Hey Amud Aleph 25a. Nitma hakometz v'hekriva. So we'll say it's a really interesting halacha over here. If the kometz becomes tamei and you offer up the kometz. Okay, so whatever happened over here, the kometz became tamei v'hekrivo, and you offered it up anyway. Hatzitz miratza. The tzitz, ultimately, again, what's the tzitz? The tzitz is the gold plate that the Kohen Gadol wears on his forehead that says Kodesh LaHashem, sanctified for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When we say the tzitz is miratza, that means the tzitz has the ability to go ahead and affect atonement for certain things. Again, now what that means when the tzitz is miratza is if the Kohen is wearing the tzitz has the ability to affect atonement for certain things. Apparently, one of the things that the tzitz has the ability to be miratza for is tuma. So therefore, again, Kohen has a kometz. The kometz became tamei. He really shouldn't offer it up. That's what it sounds like. If he did offer it up, it's effective. Effective means the carbon is effective and it counts towards the obligation of the owner. Why? Because the tzitz is miratza. So the Gemara says, good. So yatsa v'hekrivo and hatzitz miratza. What happens if the kometz was taken out of the Beis Hamikdash? So in this case, we'll both say again, this is a case of yatsa. In the case of yatsa, the kometz itself was taken outside of the walls, outside of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. What's the halacha? The tzitz does not affect atonement for that. Why? The tzitz has the ability to affect atonement for tumah, meaning for something that was offered up in a state of tumah, even though it should not have been offered up. The tzitz has the ability to affect atonement for that, but the tzitz does not affect atonement for yotzei, for something that is taken out of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. Very interesting. So we'll say, let's analyze this. So now the first order of business is, how do you know that? How do we know that the tzitz atones for certain things and doesn't atone for other things? It says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanon, V'nasa Aaron es avon hakadoshim. So the pasuk says that literally again. Now this is talking about the tzitz. So the pasuk is, I'll just read to you the pasuk in its entirety. V'haya al meitzach Aaron. The tzitz will be on the forehead of Aaron. V'nasa Aaron es avon hakadoshim, and Aaron literally again will carry, or will lift up, or will atone for the iniquity of sacred items. It shall be on his forehead at all times, to affect atonement before Hashem. That's the pasuk in its entirety. Now says the Gemara, V'nasa Aaron es avon hakadoshim. So we'll say, so now, just to understand, this concept that the tzitz affects atonement, it's an explicit pasuk. That's the pasuk. V'nasa Aaron es avon hakadoshim. Aaron will go ahead and carry. Nasa, by the way, also means a lashon of like lifting up and removing the sin of the kachim. So that tells us automatically that by wearing the tzitz, Aaron is able to affect atonement for some type of sin regarding kachim. V'chi eza avon hu nosei. What sin is he atoning for? Im tomar avon pegel. Maybe it's pegel. Maybe it's pegel, right? If the coin had a machshavas pegel, maybe at the end of the day, the tzitz is maratza. For that, harek varnemar lo yechashev. So the pasuk says by pegel that pegel can never be counted, meaning pegel can never be effective. There's nothing that can make pegel effective. All right. I im tomar avon nosar. What about nosar? So maybe the tzitz could affect atonement for nosar. Harek varnemar lo yeratzeh. The pasuk already says explicitly by nosar, ultimately again it will not be effective or it will not be accepted. Ha enonose ela avon tuma shehutra michlala b'tzibur. So Rabbi said this is very interesting. Rather, it must be, what does the tzitz affect atonement for? For tuma. That if you inadvertently, well, we'll have to see it inadvertently, if you offered up a carbon in a state of tuma, that ultimately again the tzitz says the carbon will be effective. Now again, why? Because they're both saying there's precedent for a carbon that is tamei being effective. What's the precedent for that? Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor. Right? There are certain circumstances where if the tzibor, if the congregation is tamei, you can proceed with sacrificial service. So because we have this halachic precedent that sometimes tumah is permitted in a state of sacrificial service or for sacrificial service, so the tzitz said what the tzitz does is, if you offered up a carbon in a state of tumah, halacha lamaisa, the carbon is effective. Incredible. Incredible. I will say, by the way, the makar, right? The makar, what's the source that Tumotra B'Tzibor? So Rashi points out over here, Shehotra Michlala B'Tzibor Dichsiv B'Tamid B'Mo'ado B'Afila B'Tumah. So interestingly enough, the source that Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor is the carbon tamid. The Torah says, when do you offer up the carbon tamid? When? B'Mo'ado, and it's appointed time. Meaning, no matter what's going on, you offer up that tamid. Right, you offer up that tamid, tamei, not tamei, which I will say, if you think about it, is such a tremendous Moser Haskell, right? Because the whole yisod of carbon tamid is consistency, right? So when do you have to be consistent? This is important yisod. When do you have to be consistent? Right, all the time, right? Now I will say, just understand what that means. Is that a lot of times in life, it is easy to be consistent. It's never easy to be consistent, but it's easier to be consistent when halacha l'maisa I'm in a good spot in life. Well, like the Baal Shem Tov was talking, when I'm in a moment of aliyah, right? When I'm in those moments of yerida, and I don't feel good about myself, very often we just think to ourselves, well, once I already don't feel good about myself, what's the point of what I'm doing? Right? What's the point? I've messed up so badly. What's the point of this other stuff? And it's incredible. What does the Torah say? Even when you're in a bad spot in life, even when you're in one of the valleys, even when you're in a moment of yerida, the halacha is, the Torah says, b'moado, keep going, keep doing. You say, but what's the point? What's the point of learning? What's the point of learning this Gemara? What's the point of doing this mitzvah? If I know the behaviors I'm engaging in, if I know the negativity that I'm doing, if I know that I'm not living the right life, what's the point? Because we both say that's the avodah of a yid. A yid keeps going even when I know I'm not on the right spot, even when I'm in a valley, even in a moment of yerida. Talmud says, keep doing what you're doing. You feel like a hypocrite? You know what? Join the club. We're all hypocrites. There's not one person here who is not a profound hypocrite, right? Why? Because I will say, every single day, what do? We do averos. Yeah, I love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What about all the averos? Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, right? I'm a hypocrite. But you know what? Lean into it, right? Lean into it. Yeah, I'm a hypocrite and proud. No, don't say that, right? Right. But Lamaisa, acknowledge that most of us live our lives in a constant and perpetual state of hypocrisy. That's the nature of the human condition. But don't let your inherent hypocrisy stop you from still doing good. That's the godless of the carbon tamid. You're tamei, you're tahar, you still offer the tamid. Because no matter where you are in your own life, you can't stop doing the good things. It's hypocritical? Yes, it is. But that's okay, because most of us, right, from the time that we're old enough to recognize that we have free choice, we begin to live in this state of hypocrisy, and it generally only ends after we draw our last breath. But our avoda is to continue to do good, even in that state of consistent hypocrisy. Incredible. In that event, so the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, the tzitz goes ahead and affects atonement for karbanos offered up in a state of tumah, right? Why? Because we find precedent for tumah hutra b'tzibor. So since there are karbanos that are already offered up in a state of tumah, therefore halacha l'maisa, the tzitz allows for the carbon to be offered up, or affects atonement for tumah as well. I am asking Rabbi Zera, ema avon yotze, maybe not. Maybe the tzitz ultimately again is meratza for yotze. In other words, we'll say, what's yotze? Yotze is halacha l'maisa if the carbon is taken outside of its proper precincts. Maybe the tzitz says that carbon could still be effective. Why? We see precedence for that as well. What's the precedent that yotze is effective? Shehotar michlalo bebama. That's interesting. There's precedent that yotze works. Where do we see that? Bama, private altar. Right? Where's a private altar? Where does a private altar get bought? Wherever you want it, right? Wherever you want it. So it's just like yotze is mutter by bama, so too maybe the tzitz should affect atonement for carbonic material that was taken out of its proper precincts. The pasuk says l'ratzon laHashem. L'ratzon lahem lifnei Hashem. So the pasuk says by the tzitz, it will affect atonement for them lifnei Hashem, before God. Avon de lifnei Hashem in, avon de yotze lo. The tzitz affects atonement for a sin committed in the presence of Hashem, but for a sin committed outside of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it does not work. What's an example of a sin committed in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Tumah. So Tumah, what's an example of a sin committed not in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Ultimately, Yotze. So the tzitz will work for Tumah, not work for Yotze. Maskar Rabbi Eloi, Ema avon small, shehoter michlalo b'yom kippurim. Very interesting. Maybe the tzitz should affect atonement if the Kohen committed the sin of doing the avodah with his left hand. Right? Remember again, you can't do avodah with your left hand. You have to do it with your right hand. That's why again, being a lefty for a Kohen is a mum. Right? You can't do the avodah. So the Gemara says as follows. So maybe the tzitz comes to atone if the Kohen did the avodah with his left hand. Why? Because we find precedent that sometimes avodah with the left hand is permitted. Where is that? Yom Kippur. Because in Yom Kippur, we'll say, remember again, by the Ketores, the Kohen has to utilize both hands. One hand in which to hold the ladle with the spoon with the Ketores, and the other in which to hold the fire pan with the coals. So perhaps again, Rashi says over here, you hold the fire pan ultimately again with your right hand, and the kaf, the spoon or the ladle with the ketores in your left. So maybe the tzitz comes to affect atonement if you did the avodah with your left hand. No, the tzitz comes to be meratzeh for something that was an avera, inherently an avera, and therefore again, its prohibition is set aside by the tzitz. Lafuki Yom Kippurim dechshero b'smolhu. Yom Kippur is different, I will say, because Yom Kippur is not just the pshat that you can do the avodah with your left hand, but rather what? You must. So that's not what the tzitz is meratzeh for. Rav Ashi says, Avon HaKadoshim v'lo Avon HaMakdishin. So Rav Ashi says, the reason also it doesn't affect atonement for the left hand is because what the tzitz does, the tzitz affects atonement in something that is wrong in the carbon, not something that is wrong in the Kohen. So the Gemara says, Amar le Rav Sima breid Rav Idi le Rav Ashi, v'Amar le Rav Sima breid Rav Ashi le Rav Ashi, ve'ema Avon ba'mum, shehoter michlalo ba'ofos. Maybe the tzitz comes to affect atonement if you offered up a carbon that's a bal mum, because we see that under certain circumstances a mum is permitted ultimately again by a carbon. Where is that? By birds. We spent a lot of time on this in Menachos Zvachim. The Amar Mar Tamos v'zichros bebehema vein tamos v'zichros ba'ofos. Because remember again, we learned that ultimately again, unblemished kite and zichros, which means it has to be a male, is only a din by animal offerings, not a din by birds. So we see from here that you could bring a blemished bird as a carbon. So perhaps the tzitz affects atonement for an animal that was offered up while blemished. To which the Gemara says, back to the pasuk said, Lo yeratzeh ki lo l'ratzon yihiyeh lochem. So we'll say, so ultimately again, no, because when it comes to a mum, the Torah explicitly says, Lo yeratzeh. The Torah categorically rejects such a carbon like that. Ki lo l'ratzon yihiyeh lochem. It will never be in accordance with the will of God, ultimately, that such a carbon like that is offered. So bottom line, there is no way to say that a bal mum should ever be accepted. So I will say, so it turns out we learned a very important halacha over here. So first of all, that the tzitz is meratzeh for tumah. That as long as the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz, if a carbon was offered up in a state of tumah, the carbon will be effective. Where do we know that from? From the pasuk, V'nasa Aaron es avon hakadoshim. Aaron will literally carry upon him, lift up, atone for the sin of the kachim, the karbanos. And then the Gemara goes through the process to show that it's daf tumah and not anything else. It's very important. So the tzitz only affects atonement in cases of tumah. But in cases where there's some other type of carbonic disqualification, the tzitz, as powerful as it is, will not work. Incredible. Tana Abanon. Dam shenitma bizarko b'shogeg hortza. So we'll say a very interesting case over here. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. If blood became tameh, so this is sacrificial blood, right? The blood. This is so again. Shechted the animal, did kabbalah, taking it. Let's say halacha, now taking it over to the mizbeach. On the way over there, the blood becomes tameh before zrika. But you did it, but you sprinkled it. You did zrika anyway. V'zarko b'shogeg hortza. If you sprinkled it b'shogeg, ultimately again it'll work. B'mezid lo hurtza. But if you sprinkled it, if you used tamei blood intentionally for zrika, it will not work. So the Gemara says, when is that so? B'yachid. This is only true ultimately again with individual offering of al betzibor. But if you did something communally, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid hurtza, then ultimately again, whether you did it intentionally or unintentionally, the carbon will be effective. So we'll say fascinating halacha over here. So according to the Tanakama, halacha l'maisa, you have tamei sacrificial blood. If you intentionally sprinkled it, the carbon is not good. Unintentionally sprinkled it, the carbon is effective. That's true by yachid. But by tzibor, unintentionally, intentionally, either way, it is going to be good. Incredible. But Oved Kochavim, this is fascinating. What happens about the carbon by a guy? Look at Rashi, Oved Kochavim. Oved Kochavim sheshilach karbano v'nit mahadam. Now again, halacha l'maisa, remember, we'll say, a non-Jew, a Gentile, could also offer up a carbon. He could send, right? He could send the carbon to the Beis HaMikdash. So let's say now by an Oved Kochavim, the blood of his carbon became tamei. If that's the case, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'ones, bein b'ratzim, then whether the blood became tamei intentionally, unintentionally, extenuating circumstances, non-extenuating circumstances, amid days, lo hurtza. It does not work. So we'll say we see from here ultimately again that the carbon of a Gentile is treated differently than the carbon of a Jew, right? So again, the carbon of a Jew, according to this first opinion, the carbon of a Jew, if the blood was individual Jew, if the blood was offered up, if blood is tamei offered up unintentionally, b'shogeg, the carbon works. B'mezid, the carbon will not work. Carbon sibor always works. By a Gentile, obviously there's no carbon sibor. By a Gentile, by an akum, and if he goes ahead, the blood becomes tamei, again, intentionally, unintentionally, the blood and the carbon is ineffective. So ask the Gemara, we'll say, Chafei base 25b, or Minu. The Gemara asks the kasha, what's the kasha? Al mahat tzitz meratza. What does the tzitz provide atonement for? Al adam v'ala basra v'ala chilev shenitma. So again, the tzitz is meratza, whether it's blood, sacrificial meat, chilev, the fats, any carbonic part that became tamei. Ultimately, again, the tzitz is maratza for. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'ones, bein b'ratzim, bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibor. And no matter what, individual, communal, shogeg, mezid, ones, so we'll say, so this is an obvious kasha, because remember again, what did the Brisa say? The Brisa said that for an individual carbon, the only time that tamei blood is effective is when offered up a shogeg. But here the Brisa clearly indicates that the tzitz is meratza for everything in any circumstance. So what's going on over here? Rabbi Yosef lo kasha. Rabbi Yosef said it's not a contradiction. Rabbi Yossi, Harabanan. Two different opinions. So the Gemara says, where do we see this? This is very interesting. Ein tarmin min hatame al hatar. In general, when we'll say separating out tithe, separating truma, you cannot go ahead and separate for tamei produce as truma for tahar produce. Okay? Ve'im tara. What if you did it? Well, so that's the halacha. B'shogeg truma so truma, b'mezid ein truma so truma. So ultimately, again, if you did it b'shogeg, okay, fine, it'll work. But b'mezid, ultimately, again, it does not work. It does not work. Rabbi Yossi says, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, truma so truma. Rabbi Yossi says, no, whether you did it b'shogeg, whether you did it b'mezid, ultimately, again, it's going to work. So Rabbi Yossi wants to suggest that ultimately, again, the first brisa that we quoted on Amud Aleph, that aligns with the opinion of the Rabbanon. That same Rabbanon who said that if you accidentally separate out tamei truma, right, for tahar produce, that it'll work, will also say, if you b'shogeg offered up tamei blood, it'll work. And ultimately, again, Rabbi Yossi, who says, no, shogeg, mezid, whatever you did, it works, will also say, by tamei blood, whether you did it b'shogeg or b'mezid, it'll work. Okay, that's easy enough. So Gemara says, here's the problem. Eimer d'sham say Rabbi Yossi, de lo kanis, de miratz, de lo kanis. So we'll say, here's the problem. So we'll say a piece of backdrop to this, right? If you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says over here, "B'shogeg truma so truma" in the first short line. Rashi says, "Darmina mekamaduchti v'lo siso alav chet im eno kadosh nesias chet lama mikan l'tar min hara ala yafesh truma so truma." So here's an important piece of information. Again, we'll say part of the beauty of the daf are like these facts that we pick up along the way. Halacha l'maisa, if you intentionally separated tamei produce as truma for tahar produce, midaraisa, it works. It works. The Rabbanan came along and knast you. They penalized you. The next Rashi says, in Truma Truma, the Rabbanan kansu mishum dehezid. The Rabbanan penalized you. Right? So Rabbi says, now watch this. The Gemara says, 1 second, hold up. So Rabbi Yossi, right? Rabbi Yossi is the one who apparently disputes this knas, right? He holds the rabbis never penalized you. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, the biblical law is the biblical law, which is if you separate out truma, right? Truma tameya for produce that is tahar, it works. It works. So just because Rabbi Yossi says there's no knas, the meratza tzitz al achilos mishamislei, is Rabbi Yossi going to hold that ultimately again the tzitz allows you to go ahead and allow for consumption, right? Because again, halacha l'maisa, is he going to go ahead and say that the tzitz is meratza in every case? Is he actually going to say that? Vatanya. So again, I will say all the Gemara is saying over here is you're trying to link two cases that may not be linkable, right? So you're trying to say that in the same way that ultimately, again, Rabbi Yossi says that even if you separate it out, Tamei Truma, on Tahar produce, it works. So too, if you sprinkled blood that became Tamei, B'mezid, B'shogeg, Ba'one, Suberatzan, it works. Which means says, hold up. The case of Truma, ultimately, again, is a case of a Knas Rabbanan. So maybe Rabbi Yossi disagrees with that, but how do you go from there to say that ultimately he's going to allow the tzitz, to allow the blood to be effective, and by extension allow for consumption of karbanos? That's a very big jump. The Gemara says, Hatanya, we learned, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Hatzitz meratza alachilos. Now again, I will say this is very interesting. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says over here that Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz is meratza, not only, by the way, to allow for the blood to be offered up, but also for the carbonic meat to be consumed. Rabbi Yossi says, Ein hatzitz meratza ala achilos. Rabbi Yossi says, no, the tzitz does not allow for consumption. In other words, at most what the tzitz allows for is what? Is the zrika, is the sprinkling of the blood. But again, I both say, and by the way, that's okay, because remember, right, Karbanos 101, what's the most important part of a carbon? Zrika. So once Zrika is done, the carbon is effective. So again, interestingly enough, so here the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer says, but the tzitz is so effective that not only does it allow for Zrika, it will allow for consumption of carbonic meat as well. Rabbi Yossi says, no way. The tzitz will allow for Zrika, but does not allow for consumption, to which the Gemara says, first of all, epoch, switch around those shitos. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Eina tzitz meratza al achilos. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says that the tzitz affects, in other words, the tzitz allows you to do zrika, but will not allow you to consume. Rabbi Yossi says, hatzitz meratza al achilos. Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that no, the tzitz even allows for consumption. All right, so Rabbi say, so we have a lot going on over here. So first of all, the overarching machlokes that we have to deal with is what cases does the tzitz affect atonement for? That's our overarching shaila. So clearly what everyone is going to agree on, what's the case that everyone agrees on, right, is shogeg. Right, shogeg, everyone is going to agree that tzitz mas shogeg. What happens b'mezid? That's machlokes. The other piece that everybody seems to agree on is halacha l'maisa tzibor. Right, that the tzitz will always be meratza for the tzibor, no matter shogeg, mezid, which also makes sense because tuma hutra b'tzibor. The other piece that now is an outstanding machlokes is we know that tzitz allows for zrika to occur. The question is, does tzitz also allow for consumption? So just keep all of this in your mind. We're not going to get to this halacha today, but in Hashem tomorrow, when we close out the sugya, we'll see all of this. All right, so let's go back there. So Maskef Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes raised the kasha, Umi matzis ichpaslei. So ultimately, again, is this really material? Ultimately, again, to our we learned. Listen to this. But yachol basar shenitma lifnei zrikas damim yuchayavin alein mishum tuma. Okay, so now watch this. The Brisa says as follows: I might have thought that sacrificial meat that becomes tamei before the blood is sprinkled. Before the blood is sprinkled, so the Gemara says, I'm sorry. I might have thought that alocha l'maisa there would be liability for it for tuma. Now, what's this case? I might have thought that, again, remember, sacrificial meat before zrika has occurred. The sacrificial meat is already tamei. I might have thought that if I am tamei and I consume that meat in a state of tuma, that there's liability, right? Liability for consuming sacrificial meat in a state of tumah. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Yachol, but it's almost right across. No, not really. It's right across and 5 lines down. Yachol basar shenitmo lefnei zrikas damim va'achlu lefnei zrika b'tumas hagov. So it's an interesting case. So the sacrificial meat is tamei already before zrika. I am also tamei. So I eat a piece of sacrificial meat in a state of personalistic tumah before zrika has occurred. So Gemara says, "You chayavin alav kares ubetaras konim masasi lashon nekia yachu you chayavin mishum tumas agof of nezrika ubasar tar kamari." So we'll say, so now, okay, leaving aside the second gear of Rashi, I'm going to thought like this: if I consume sacrificial meat in a state of tumah, and I myself am in a state of tumah, and all of this is happening before zrika, I might have thought that there should be liability in a case like that. Talmud Lomar called tahar yochal basar. Anyone who is tahar can eat sacrificial meat. V'hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlam asher la'Hashem v'tumasalav. But any person who will eat sacrificial meat and his tumah is upon him, v'nichrasa, he goes ahead and he gets kares. Now, what do I infer from that? I'll say, watch this. Hanitar l'tahorin chayavin alav mishum tumah. Sacrificial meat, which is permitted to someone who is tahar, that's the type of sacrificial meat that you are chayiv for if you eat it in a state of tumah. However, v'she'eno nitra l'tahorin, sacrificial meat which would not be permitted to someone who is tahar. We'll say, what's an example of sacrificial meat that would not be permitted to someone who's tahar? The sacrificial meat itself is already tamei. Ein chayavin alav mishum tumah. You are not chayiv because of tumah for that. So we'll say, which would mean, interestingly enough, if you have a piece of sacrificial meat that is already tamei before zrika, and I myself am tamei, and I eat that, there's not liability for kares. The way the pasuk is framed is there's only liability for kares if the sacrificial meat itself would have been permitted to someone who is tahar. But if the sacrificial meat already from the beginning would not be permitted to someone who is tahar, ultimately again, there is no liability for kares. Right? So we'll say, so again, or perhaps it's different. Perhaps, ultimately again, it is only that which can be consumed by tahorim that you are chayiv for. Mishum tumah. V'she'eno ne'achal l'tahorin, but something that cannot be consumed by someone who is tahar, ein chayav ala mishum tumah. You're not liable for tumah. Now, both say, what's the distinction there? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi says, I'm sorry, let me go back just for one moment. V'she'eno nitra l'tahorin, Rashi says, kigon, im achal afilu basar tar b'tumas aguf kodem zrikas dam adayin lo haisen iter satorah. So I just want to point out, just look at the interesting distinction between the lashonos. In the first framing of this machlokes, the Gemara says maybe it's only meat that is mutter to tahorim, that if you ate it in a state of tumah, ultimately you're liable kares. Now, what's an example of meat which is permitted to tahorim? It's what? Number one, tahar. But number two, when? Post zrika. Remember, you can't eat sacrificial meat post zrika. So if you have, pre zrika. So if you have meat that is tamei pre zrika, you can't eat that on 2 counts. Number one, it's before zrika. Number two, it's tamei. So perhaps that type of meat, if you were to eat it in a state of tumah, there's no liability. The second iteration of this is no. It's what type of meat? Anything that can be consumed ultimately again by someone who is tahar. What does that mean? Ultimately, again, it's anything that could technically be consumed. We don't look as much about state-wise, rather we look at tumah versus tara. So if it's tar, it can be consumed. If it's tamei, it can't be consumed. If that's the case, then maybe the distinction pre-zrika, post-zrika wouldn't really factor in. Something which can be consumed ultimately again by someone who is tahar. You are chayiv if you consume it in a state of tumah. But something that cannot be consumed by someone who is tar, you're not liable ultimately again if you eat it in a state of tumah. What would this exclude? I would exclude from this ultimately again, lun. Lun means a carbon that is kept overnight, right, past its permitted time, or yotze, something that's taken out of the Beis Hamikdash. She'inon ne'echalin l'tahorin. Because remember again, these cannot be consumed by people, ultimately again, who are tar. Talmud Lomar. Therefore, the pasuk says, "Asher laHashem riba." Therefore, the pasuk says that which is to Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Ultimately, again, it has come to include these additional cases. Which Rabbi essentially says as follows: that halacha l'maisa, you are chayiv for a carbon which cannot be consumed now in this present state for tahorin, but ultimately, again, was permitted for tahorin at the time of zrika, right? So halacha l'maisa, that's the metric. In order to be liable kares for consuming a carbon in a state of tumah, that carbon had to have been permitted at the time of zrika. What does that come to exclude? That'll exclude ultimately again a carbon which was already tamei before zrika. That if you eat that in a state of tumah, you're not liable to kares. Now again, it's not good. You're not allowed to do it, but there's not liability for kares. You're only chayiv kares if the carbon itself was permitted to be consumed at the time of zrika. Incredible. So we must yachal shanim arbes hapigulin ves hanosaros. I might have thought that I should also include in this pigul. Pigul and nosar. Tishwan says, first of all, nosar haya lan, right? So hainu lan. So nosar and lan is the same thing. Ela afa pigulin kinosaros. Or maybe I would have thought ultimately again, pigul should be treated just like nosar. Talmud Lomar mizbeach hashlamim mi'et. Therefore, again, Abba said mizbeach hashlamim comes to exclude these cases. Uma rois l'rabos es elu or l'hotzi es elu. But again, I will say, interesting enough, the Gemara says, how do you know what to include and what to exclude? To which the Gemara says, Mar be'ani es elu shaisel and shasa kosher. I include these cases where at a certain point the carbon was initially kosher. Umotzi ani es elu shelo haisalahen shasa kosher. And I can exclude these other cases because these other cases were sacrificially unfit from the beginning. All right, but so you don't have to stop over here now. It's a little bit mid-sentence. We'll close out this sugya tomorrow. And also, Meretz Hashem, remember, not most important, it's all important, but most importantly for us, see halacha l'maisa, what does the tzitz do? How far-reaching are the powers of the tzitz? Exciting Rambam tomorrow, Bosai. Shkoyach. All right, everyone, Zoom, have a great day, everyone. How are you? Oh, Hashem, good. Thank you so much. I like good. Oh, Hashem. Baruch Hashem. He's doing great. Thank you. That's Hashem, are you? Okay. I'll give him another. Whatever.